네, 영어원서 읽기 500번 읽기. 오늘은 오전에 이제 한번 읽었고, 일하는 막간에 읽었었기 때문에 한 번밖에 못 읽어서 저녁에 이제 자기 전에 또 읽어볼 수 있도록 하겠습니다. 자, Chapter 1부터 시작할 텐데요. 기왕에 하는 것도 Editor's Note부터 선문부터 시작해서 또 한번 읽어보도록 하겠습니다. Editor's Note. The book you are about to read was brought to my attention in a most unusual way. One Friday afternoon, just before closing time, I heard a scratching sound at the front door of my office. When I opened the door, there stood a sad-eyed, droopy-eared dog carrying a large plain envelope in his mouth. He dropped it at my feet, gave me a soulful glance, and with great quiet dignity sauntered away. Inside the envelope was the manuscript of the book you now hold in your hand, together with this letter. Gentlemen, the enclosed story is true. It happened in this very town to me and the family with whom I reside. I have changed names of the family in order to protect them. But in all other respects, everything you will read here is factual. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Harold. I come to writing purely by chance. My full-time occupation is dog, and I live with Mr. and Mrs. X, called here the Mourners, and their two sons, Toby, aged 8, Pete, aged 10. And also sharing our home is a cat named Chester, whom I am pleased to call my friend. We were a typical American family, and still are, though the events related in my story have, of course, had their effect on our lives. I hope you will find this tale of sufficient interest to yourself and your readers to warrant its publication. Sincerely, Harold X. 이게 선문이었습니다. 자, 이제 Chapter 1 읽어보겠습니다. Chapter 1. The Arrival. I shall never forget the first time I laid these now tired old eyes on our visitor. I had been left home by the family with the admonition to take care of the house until they returned. That's something they always say to me when they go out. Take care of the house, Harold. You are the watchdog. I think it's their way of making up for not taking me with them, as if I wanted to go anyway. You can't lie down at the movies and still see the screen. And people think you are being impolite if you fall asleep and start to snore or scratch yourself in public. No, thank you. I'd rather be stretched out on my favorite rug in front of a nice whistling radiator. But I digress. I was talking about that first night. Well, it was cold, and the rain was pelting the windows, the wind was howling, and it felt pretty good to be indoors. I was lying on the rug with my head on my paws, just staring absently at the front door. My friend Chester was curled up on the brown velvet armchair, which years ago he'd staked out as his own. I saw that once again he'd covered the whole seat with his cat hair, and I chuckled to myself, picturing the scene tomorrow, next to grasshoppers There is nothing that frightens Chester more than the vacuum cleaner. In the midst of this reverie, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I didn't even bother to get up and see who it was. I knew it had to be my family, the Murnos, since it was just about time for the movie to be over. After a moment, the front door flew open. There they stood in the doorway, Toby and Pete and Mom and Dad Monroe. There was a fresh light. There was a flash of lightning, and in each glare, I noticed that Mr. Monroe was carrying a little bundle, a bundle with tiny, glistening eyes. Pete and Toby bounded into the room, both talking at the top of their lungs. Toby shouted, "Put him over here, Dad. Take your boots off. You are soaking wet," replied his mother. Somewhat calmly, I thought, under the circumstances. "But Mom, what about?" "First, stop dripping on the carpet." "Would somebody like to take this?" asked Mr. Monroe, indicating the bundle with the eyes. "I'd like to remove my coat." "I will," Pete yelled. "No, I will," said Toby. "I found him." "You will drop him." "I will not." "You will too." "Mom, Pete punched me." "I will take him," said Mrs. Monroe. "Take off your coat this minute." But she became so involved in helping the boys out of their coat that she didn't take him at all. My tranquil evening had been destroyed, and no one had even said hello to me. I whimpered to remind them that I was there. "Harold," cried Toby, "guess what happened to me?" And then, all over again, everyone started talking at once. At this point, I feel I must explain something in our family. Everyone treats everyone else with great respect for his or her intelligence. That goes for the animals as well as the people. Everything that happens to them is explained to us. It's never been just, "Good boy, Harold," or "Use the little box, Chester," at our house. Oh no. With us, it's "Hey, Harold, Dad got a raise and now we are in a higher tax bracket." Or, "Come, sit on the bed, Chester, and watch this Wild Kingdom show. Maybe you will see, maybe you will see a relative," which shows just how thoughtful they are. But after all, Mr. Monroe is a college professor, and Mrs. Monroe is a lawyer, so we think of it as a rather special household, and we are therefore rather special pets. So it wasn't at all surprising to me that they took the time to explain the strange circumstances surrounding the arrival of the little bundle with the glistening eyes now among us. It seems that they had arrived at the theater late, and rather than trip over the pit of the audience already seated, they decided to sit in the last row, which was empty. They tiptoed in and sat down very quietly, so they wouldn't disturb anyone. Suddenly, Toby, who's the little one, sprang up from his chair and squealed that he had sat on something. Mr. Monroe told him to stop making a fuss and move to another seat. But in an unusual display of independence, Toby said he wanted to see just what it was he had sat on. An usher came over to their row to shush them, and Mr. Monroe borrowed his flashlight. What they found on Toby's chair was the little blanket bundle that was now sitting on Mr. Monroe's lap. They now unwrapped the blanket, and there in the center was a tiny black and white rabbit, sitting in a shoebox filled with dirt. A piece of paper had been tied to his neck with a ribbon. There were words on the paper, but the Monroes were unable to decipher them. Because they were in a totally unfamiliar language, I moved closer for a better look. Now, most people might call me a mongrel, but I have some pretty French bloodlines running through these veins, and the Russian Wolfhound happened to be one of them. Because my family got around a lot, I was able to recognize language as an obscure dialect of the Carpathian mountain region. Roughly translated, it read, "Take good care of my baby." But I couldn't tell if it was a note from a bereaved mother or a piece of Romanian sheet music. The little guy was shivering from fear and cold. It was decided that Mr. Monroe and the boys would make a house for him out of an old crate and some heavy-duty wire mesh from the garage. For the night, the boys would make a bed for him in a shoebox. Toby and Pete ran outside to find the crate, and Mrs. Monroe went to the kitchen to get him some milk and lettuce. Mr. Monroe sat down, a dazed expression in his eyes, as if he were wondering how he came to be sitting in his own living room in a wet raincoat with a strange bunny on his lap. I signaled to Chester, and the two of us casually moved over to a corner of the room. We looked at each other. "Well, what do you think?" I asked. "I don't think rabbits like milk," he answered. Chester and I were unable to continue our conversation because a deafening crash commanded our attention. Pete yelled from the hallway, "Ma, Toby broke the rabbit's house." "I didn't. I just dropped it. Pete won't let me carry it. It's too big. Toby's too little." "I am not. You're too. Okay, fellas," Mrs. Monroe called out as she entered with the milk and lettuce. "Let's try to get it in here with as little hysteria as possible. Please." Chester turned to me and said under his breath, That lettuce looks repulsive, but if there's any milk left, I get it." I certainly wasn't going to argue with him. I'm a waterman myself. At that moment, the crate arrived, barely standing the strain of being pulled in two directions at once. "Ma, Toby says he's going to keep the rabbit in his room. That's not fair. Harold sleeps in his room." "Only sometimes," I thought, "when I know he's got a leftover ham sandwich in his drawer. Toby's a nice kid, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't hurt that he shared his stash with me." It was, after all, at one of those late-night parties in Toby's room that I first developed my taste for chocolate cake, and Toby, noting my preference, has kept me in chocolate cake ever since. Pete, on the other hand, doesn't believe in sharing, and the only time I tried to sleep on his bed, he rolled over on me and pinned me by my ears so that I couldn't move for the rest of the night. I had a crick in my neck for days. "But he's mine," Toby said. "I found him." "You sat on him. You mean I found him and he's sleeping in my room. You can keep Smelly Old Harold in your room, and Chester too, if you want to, but I'm going to keep the rabbit in mine." Smelly Old Harold? I would have bitten his ankle. But I knew he hadn't changed his socks for a week. Smelly indeed. Mr. Monroe spoke up. "I think the best place for the rabbit is right here, in the living room, on that table by the window. It's light there, and he will get lots of fresh air." "Pete's taller than I am," Toby cried. "He will be able to see the rabbit better." "Too bad, Squirt." "Okay," said Mrs. Monroe through clenched teeth. "Let's put him to bed and make him comfortable, and then we can all get some sleep." "Why?" Pete asked. "I don't want to go to sleep." Mrs. Monroe smiled a little too sweetly at Pete. "Look, Ma," said Toby. "He's not drinking his milk." Chester nudged me in the ribs. "Didn't I tell you?" He asked, "Excuse me while I make myself available." "Hey," said Toby, "we gotta name him." "Can that wait until tomorrow?" asked Mr. Monroe. The boys shouted in unison. "No, he has to have a name right now. He has to have a name right now. I have to say I agreed with them. It took them 3 days to name me, and those were the 3 most anxious days of my life. I couldn't sleep at all, worrying that they were really gonna call me Fluffy, as Mrs. Murnau had suggested." "Well, all right," sighed Mrs. Murnau. "What about, say, Bun Bun? Uh-oh, there she goes again," I thought. "Where does she get them?" "Yuck," we all said. "Well then, how about Fluffy?" she offered hopefully. Pete looked at his mother and smiled. "You never give up, do you, Ma?" Meanwhile, Chester, who had also been named Fluffy for a short time, was rubbing against Mrs. Murnau's ankles and purring loudly. "No, Chester, not now," she said, pushing him aside. "He wants to help us name him, don't you, Chester?" Toby asked, as he scooped him up into his arms. Chester shot me a look. I could tell this was not what he had in mind. "Come on, Harold," Toby called. "You've got to help with the name too." I joined the family, and the serious thinking began. We all peered into the box. It was the first time I had really seen him. "So, this is your rabbit," I thought. "He sort of looks like a Chester, only he's got longer ears and a shorter tail and a motor in his nose." "Well," said Pete, after a moment, "since we found him at the movies, why don't we call him Mr. Johnson?" There was a moment of silence. "Who's Mr. Johnson?" asked Toby. "The guy who owns the movie theater," Pete answered. No one seemed to like the idea. "How about the Prince?" said Mr. Monroe. "That," said Toby. "Are you kidding?" "Well, I had a dog named Prince once," he replied lamely. "Prince, I thought that's a silly name for a dog. We found him at a Dracula movie. Let's call him Dracula." That Toby said. "That's a stupid name," said Pete. "No, it's not. And anyway, I found him, so I should get to name him." "Mom, you're not going to let him name him, are you? That's favoritism, and I will be traumatized if you do." Mrs. Murnau looked in wonder at Pete. "Please, Mom, please, Dad, let's name him Dracula," cried Toby. "Please, please, please," and with each please, he squeezed the Chester a little harder. Mrs. Murnau picked up the bowl of milk and moved toward the kitchen. Chester followed her every movement with his eyes, which now seemed to be popping out of his head. When she reached the kitchen door, she turned back and said, "Let's not have any more arguments. We'll compromise. He's a bunny, and we found him at a Dracula movie, so we will call him Bunnicula. Bunnicula. This should make everybody happy, including me." "What about me?" muttered Chester. I won't be happy until she puts down that milk." "Well, guys, is that okay with you?" she asked. Toby and Pete looked at one another, and then at the rabbit. A smile grew on Toby's face. "Yeah, Ma, I think that name is just right." Pete shrugged. "It's okay, but I get to fit in." "Okay, I'm gonna put the milk back in the fridge. Maybe he will drink it tomorrow." "What about Chester?" Toby said, dropping the French cat to the floor. "Maybe he would like it." Chester made a beeline for Mrs. Murnau and looked up at her plaintively. Uh-oh, Cheddar doesn't want any more milk, do you, Cheddar? You've already had your milk today. She reached down, patted Cheddar on his head, and walked into the kitchen. Cheddar didn't move. Okay, bedtime, said Mr. Monroe. Good night, Bunnicula, Toby said. Good night, Count Bunnicula, Pete said sarcastically, in what I took to be his attempt at a Transylvanian accent. I may be wrong, but I thought I saw a flicker of movement from the cage. Good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. I licked Toby good night. Good night, smelly Harold. Good night, dumb Chester. I drooled on Peter's foot. Mom, Harold drooled on my foot. Good night, Pete, Mrs. Monroe said with great finality as she came back into the living room. And then more calmly, good night, Harold. Good night, Chester. Mr. and Mrs. Monroe went up the stairs together. You know, dear, Mr. Monroe said, that was very clever, Bunnicula. I couldn't ever have thought of a name like that. I couldn't ever have thought of a name like that. Oh, I don't know, Robert. She smiled as she put her arm through his. I think Prince is a lovely name, too. The room was quiet. Cheddar was still sitting by the closed kitchen door in a state of shock. Slowly, he turned to me. I wish they had named him Fluffy, was all he said. 오케이. 자, 오늘 저녁은 여기까지만 하도록 하겠습니다. 저 눈이 많이 안 좋아서 지금 전혀 글씨가 안 보이는 상태입니다. 자, 그래서 오늘은 여기까지만 하겠습니다.